So you're flying around in space one day and you get yourself a bacterial infection. Will being in space alter this infection? We're going to talk about that and so much more on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through another story chronicling the lives of the tiny and infamous. That would be, of course, the incredible and the amazing bacteria and all such associated microorganisms. Guys, I have such a really cool topic to share with you today. We're going to talk about bacteria within the context of space, which is so cool. We're going to jump into that in just a couple seconds, but first, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you are listening to this podcast on the YouTubes. If you are listening to this podcast at some other medium, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to hit that follow button to help support the channel and help support the podcast. Now, the topic for today, I'm so excited about it, is space and bacteria. How do bacteria act in space, and especially within the context of infection? This is so cool because it's an emerging field. We've spent so much time learning to fly, much less learning to fly really high, much less learning to fly high enough to the point where we can get into space, much less learning to fly really high enough to get into space, and then once in space, start asking questions about how organisms act and what they do. So this is an emerging field. Now, there's a lot of folks, and it's only recently that we've been able to start thinking about this, I feel like, in any real level of detail, but with folks like Elon Musk or the Amazon guy, Lord Bezos, as folks like them and others start to popularize and give more access to folks, giving people opportunity to travel in space, we're really starting to get, I think, a picture of what space travel, what moving to other, I almost said countries, moving to other planets would look like. I know there's folks who are like, well, gee, it'd be really cool if we could start a colony on Mars. And there's other folks who are like, well, gee, it'd be really cool if we could start a colony on the upper atmosphere of Venus. And there are other folks who are like, well, gee, why don't we just start small? Let's start a colony on something like the moon, right? And this is starting to become a little more crystallized and a little clearer as space travel is increasing, right? Now, as we start to do more space travel, as more folks are able to do space travel, interestingly, it's an opportunity to learn more about bacteria, right? As we've learned in this podcast, bacteria are intimately involved with pretty much everything that we're doing. And so it's a really important thing to talk about and learn about how is it that bacteria behave. Now, this becomes really important in the context of infection because as people start sailing across the stars, right, it's going to be important to know how bacteria behave if they've infected a human individual. How will the human behave when they are infected by a bacterial infection, right? So point number one, space travel, while it is super cool, we don't know a lot about how bacteria act in space, especially within the context of infection. So that's a really good question. As space travel increases, how will bacterial infection be impacted? Now, there was a whole gaggle of scientists from the USA and the UK. These would be people from University of College London, and then University of Chicago, that would be in London, the UK, and then also University of Chicago, that would be in the United States of America. And what they were doing is they published this review article, so they summed up a whole bunch of different journal articles, and they tried to answer this question of like, how will bacterial infection be impacted within the context of space? And so that's what we're going to talk a little about today. Now, they found a couple of really cool things, but let's just start with this first fundamental point. During space travel, the amount of infections is just going to increase, right? Now, if you think about this, this makes a little bit of sense, right? When you have a bunch of astronauts, you've put them into a small metal container, right? They can't go anywhere. They're all locked in here. It's not like they can just leave, right? And when they're in this location, right, they're going to be sharing a whole bunch of things. Right? They'll be sharing the same food sources, right? They'll be sharing the same personal items. They'll be recirculating the same air that everyone else is breathing, right? So they're sharing a whole bunch of stuff. In addition to this, even suspended, I almost said suspended animation, when there's no gravity around, right? That's going to impact this as well. Normally, bacteria, they're affected by gravity just like everything else. Viruses are affected by gravity just like everything else. But when they're in space, you'll have bacteria that normally are just pulled to the ground or ground equivalent that are just going to be floating around, right? So people are going to be running into those bacteria, running into those viruses more so than they normally would, right? So if you take all this together, you take into the fact that people are going to be in this really small enclosed space, right? And that bacteria and viruses are going to be floating around locally. That means that there's going to be a lot of bacterial and viral exchange between people. Now, this leads naturally then to a whole bunch more infections. And in fact, they gave an estimation. They estimated that a 6-person crew over a 950-day mission, they could have up to 90 estimated infections. 90 estimated infections over it looks like a 2.5 to 3 year mission, right? That's 15 times per person, right? That's a whole lot of infections. Now, so that's the first point. When you're in space, in a spaceship, the amount of infections is going to increase, or I guess that's point number 2, right? Now, that's fine and all. I mean, obviously, okay, that kind of sucks, but at least we're in space, right? And that leads to the second question, which is, how is it that humans are going to respond to these infections, right? That's the second half of the equation. You can get infected only a couple times, and if you respond poorly to the infection, then that's all you need, right? Or you could get infected a whole bunch of times, but if you have a really strong immune system, then that's not as big of a cause for concern, right? Now, we've talked a little bit about how the human body responds to infection on previous episodes of the podcast. And I want to reemphasize this point. As these different infections are going to occur, all those different 90 infections that I mentioned, as those occur, there are going to be changes not only to the person, but there's going to be changes to their microbiome as well. Now, there's a whole bunch of different downstream effects from changes in the microbiome. And one of these is changes in the activity and the reactivity of the immune system. Now, I want to quick recap a couple of different things about the immune system, right? So remember, the immune system has to balance this activity and passivity, right? We don't want the immune system to be too active. If it's too active, then we can become autoimmune and start killing our own cells. But we also don't want it to be too passive, where it doesn't respond strongly to an infection, like from a bacterial agent, and as a result, we just get overrun by the bacteria, right? So it has to hold this activity and passivity in a nice balance. And it also has to hold in balance the activity of its 2 major systems, right? And those systems would be the innate and adaptive immune systems. Now, I just want to recap what those 2 things are. There's the innate immune system, which is more like the first responders. Whenever a bacterial infection or a viral infection arrives, they recognize the foreign agent and then they just attack it and destroy it, right? That's good, but that also induces inflammation. It's more of like a Band-Aid than an actual fixing of the situation. The actual fixing of the situation comes from the adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system is more like the actual army, right? It figures out the structure of the infectious agent, and then based off the structure of that infectious agent, it can send whole swaths, huge amounts of white blood cells to go destroy the infectious agent in its entirety. Okay, so the innate immune system is first responders. It helps to slightly control the infection, but you need the adaptive immune system to come in and really deal that knockout blow. Now, it turns out that in space, you can have a more active innate system, right? Have a lot more first responders floating around, and an impaired adaptive response, right? This means that while you can get a lot of initial coverage if there's new infectious agents floating in, it takes a lot for our immune system to really deal that knockout blow to an actual infection, right? So that overall could be seen as an almost weakening of our immune system when we're in the context of space. Now, this, as I mentioned, could be from a whole different through a whole bunch of different things, right? Through manipulation of our microbiome. That's one thing that I think is a really, really important aspect to this. But it could also be through something like stress, because as it turns out, traveling in space is extremely stressful for us. So point number 3, immune systems can be misregulated in the context of space, and this can create greater susceptibility to infection. Right? So those are 2 kind of unsettling findings. Number 1, when you're in space in a spaceship, infections increase. And number 2, immune systems, when they're in space, can be misregulated, creating more susceptibility. But the coolest, and I guess this could be the most terrifying aspect, is how is it that the microbes themselves change, right? We've asked a lot of questions about how do humans change. We know that we change in the context of gravity. We know that we change in the context of microgravity. Altered gravitational fields change us. Altered temperature changes us because space is a different temperature from the Earth, as it turns out. All these different aspects, they change us. And we've asked a lot of questions about how are we changed by these things. But what about bacteria? How are bacteria influenced by space itself? Do they change their behavior? Now, it turns out, and we know this from our own experiences, space is pretty stressful, right? It's stressful for us, and it's also stressful for bacteria. And so what happens when bacteria are in a stressful environment, this triggers an adaptive response. So they have to adapt to this new environment. And now, depending on the environment, they'll adapt in a different amount of ways. So how is it that bacteria adapt in the context of space? Well, they have a couple of really wild things that they do when they're in space. The first thing, they get much angrier, right? They increase their virulence. As a way of protecting themselves more, they attack more things, right? They just want to make sure that they're safe, and so they attack a whole bunch. So that's the first thing. They increase their virulence. Number two, they grow really, really fast, right? There's an interesting paper within this review article where they talked about how, there's different stages of bacterial growth. There's within the stages of bacterial growth, there's something called exponential phase, which is when bacteria grow at an exponential rate. They go really, really fast. And when bacteria are in space, they have an increased or an amplified exponential phase. So not only are they growing really fast during this exponential phase, but they're growing really fast for a much longer amount of time, right? So bacteria, not only they're getting angry, they're also growing really, really fast, and there's more of them floating around. Number three, they form biofilms more often. We talked about biofilms previously in the podcast. Biofilms are kind of they're a complex mixture of bacteria that adhere to a specific location, and they just kind of grow out from that location. This could be a problem, obviously, for people who are infected with bacteria, but it could also be a problem for the spaceship itself if it starts degrading the actual spaceship, right? So that'd be kind of terrifying. So they form more biofilms. And finally, number four, they have increased antibiotic resistance. Now, this increased antibiotic resistance is due to things like mutations based off of cosmic radiation. There's a whole bunch of radiation that's floating around in space, and that can cause mutations that initiate antibiotic resistance in bacteria. But they can even get it from other environments, such as the vacuum of space. Yes, you heard that right. Bacteria can, certain types of bacteria can, for a certain amount of time, live in the vacuum of space. And people have found that the vacuum of space itself can be used by the bacteria as a way of deriving antibiotic resistance. So point number four, bacteria in the context of space, they get bigger, they get badder, they grow faster, they get even scarier. Now, if you put all this together, the changes of behavior of bacteria with the increased amount of infection, the fact that the immune system is getting a little weaker at this time, this is why it's so important for astronauts to be extremely healthy before they go into space. Right? They need to have really good diets. They need to be in shape. They need to have a really strong immune system. They need to be vaccinated. They need to have probiotics before they're in flight. They need to not have existing infections, right? And all these things need to be continued in flight as well as before the flight in order to ward off these new dangers. They need to maintain good diets. They need to stay in shape, all these different things. In addition to this, there are folks who are like, okay, all right, assuming that we have all these different changes happening to this microenvironment, what are some ways that we can keep these astronauts safe? And so new therapies are emerging. So they're trying to think, okay, how do we integrate something like AI into this? Is there a way to figure out, okay, these are the environmental bacteria, so this is the type of therapy that would work really well. Is there a way that we can generate something like antibiotics on demand? Is there a way that we can provide support in the case of sepsis or something like that? So there's a whole bunch of different emerging technology and emerging questions that are being asked as a way of helping astronauts when they're in space, when they're surrounded by all these wild bacteria. But that is a question for another podcast. Let's wrap up for today. Number one, space travel is so cool, but we don't know a whole lot about how bacteria act in space, especially in the context of infection. Through this review article, these folks found out that point number two, when you're in space, in a spaceship, the amount of infections is going to increase. Point number three, immune systems can be misregulated in the context of space, and that creates susceptibility to infection. And finally, point number four, bacterial behavior. Bacteria in space, they get bigger, they get badder, they grow faster, and they get much scarier. So the next time that you are traveling to Mars or Venus or Moon to start a colony, remember to keep an eye on your microbiome. Remember to keep an eye on your surrounding bacteria, because those are going to be undergoing some wild changes. But that is enough for today. Thank you so much, each and every single one of you guys, for tuning in, and I will hopefully see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria.